The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in late September, slipped under the door of the Carver house while everyone was sleeping. And when Margaret found it at dawn, a cream envelope with her name written in elegant script she didn't recognize, she felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The card inside was simple. "I'll be arriving Thursday evening. Please prepare the guest room. We have much to discuss." A. No last name, no return address, just that single initial like a signature on a contract she didn't remember signing. She stood in the entryway with the card in her trembling hands while the house woke around her, her husband James making coffee in the kitchen, her daughter Sophie getting ready for school upstairs, the dog scratching at the back door to be let out. All the ordinary sounds of an ordinary morning, except nothing felt ordinary anymore. Because someone was coming. Someone who signed their name with a single letter and assumed they'd be welcomed. And Margaret knew, she knew with the certainty of nightmares remembered upon waking, that whoever this person was, they were bringing the past with them. The Carver family had lived in Holloway for 3 generations, in the white colonial house at the end of Birch Street, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the woods pressed close enough that shadows fell across the lawn by mid-afternoon. James had inherited it from his parents, who'd inherited it from his grandparents, and the house carried the weight of all those years in its creaking floors and drafty windows, and the particular smell of old wood and older secrets. They were a respected family in town. James worked as a high school history teacher, Margaret volunteered at the library, 15-year-old Sophie was on the honor roll and played violin in the school orchestra. They were normal, unremarkable, the kind of family you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Except they weren't. Not really. And Margaret had spent 15 years making sure no one ever looked closely enough to notice. She didn't tell James about the invitation right away. She carried it in her pocket all day, feeling its presence like a weight, like evidence of a crime she'd thought buried long ago. When he came home from school that afternoon, she was making dinner, and her hands shook as she chopped vegetables. "You okay?" he asked, kissing her cheek. "You seem tense." "I'm fine, just tired." "Long day at the library?" "Something like that." She waited until after dinner, after Sophie had gone upstairs to do homework, after the dishes were washed and put away, and they were alone in the living room with cups of tea growing cold between them. Then she pulled out the invitation and handed it to him without a word. James read it, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. "Who's A?" "I don't know. You must have some idea. Someone doesn't just invite themselves to stay in your house." "I'm telling you, I don't know. I've never seen this handwriting before. I don't know anyone who'd send something like this." James reread the card, his jaw tightening. "We're not letting a stranger stay here. That's insane. What if they're not a stranger?" "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "What if it's someone from before? Someone who knows?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. James set down the card like it might burn him. "That's impossible. No one knows. We made sure of that." "Did we? Can you really be certain?" "Margaret, we were careful. We did everything right. There's no way." "Then who sent this?" Her voice rose, sharper than she intended. "Who knows we'd understand what 'we have much to discuss' means? Who feels entitled to just show up at our house?" They stared at each other, years of carefully maintained silence cracking between them. Finally, James said, "We don't let them in. Whoever it is, whatever they think they know, we just don't open the door. And if they make a scene, if they go to the police, if they tell people, tell them what? They have no proof. It's been 15 years, Margaret. There's nothing left to find." But Margaret knew better. Some things couldn't be buried deep enough. Some secrets had roots that went too far down, spreading through the dark soil of memory and guilt until they were part of the foundation itself. And now, Someone was coming to dig them up. Thursday arrived too quickly. Margaret spent the day in a state of barely controlled panic, cleaning the guest room that hadn't been used in years, changing sheets, dusting surfaces, opening windows to air out the mustiness. James thought she was crazy for preparing, but she couldn't help herself. Some part of her, the part that had been raised to be polite, to be accommodating, to never cause a scene, couldn't bear the thought of being inhospitable even to someone who might destroy them. Sophie noticed the unusual activity. "Are we having company?" she asked at dinner, picking at her pasta. "Just an old friend," Margaret said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. "Of whose? Yours or Dad's?" "Both. Someone we knew a long time ago." "What's their name?" "You wouldn't know them, honey? They've been away for years." Sophie gave her mother a look that suggested she knew she wasn't getting the full story, but was too polite to push. She'd always been like that, sensitive to tension, skilled at reading the unspoken currents in a room. Margaret wondered sometimes what her daughter sensed about them, about the house, about the careful way they lived their lives, as if always aware of being watched. The guest arrived at 7:47 p.m., precisely 3 minutes before sunset. Margaret was watching from the living room window when the car pulled up. A black sedan, expensive looking, with tinted windows that reflected the dying light. The driver's door opened and someone stepped out. Margaret's breath caught. The woman was tall and elegant, somewhere in her 50s perhaps, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a long coat despite the mild evening and carried a single leather bag. But it was her face that made Margaret's heart stutter, angular and intelligent, with dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, and a small smile playing at her lips as if she knew a joke no one else had heard yet. "James," Margaret called, her voice barely above a whisper, "she's here." He came to stand beside her, and she felt him go rigid. "Do you recognize her?" "No, but there's something familiar." The woman walked up the path with unhurried confidence, as if she'd made this journey 1,000 times before. She didn't look at the house with the curiosity of a first-time visitor, but with the recognition of someone coming home. When she reached the porch, she rang the doorbell once, then stood waiting with her hands folded in front of her, patient as death. Margaret and James looked at each other. There was a moment where they could have pretended not to be home, could have hidden in the dark and let the woman ring and knock until she finally gave up and left. But they both knew it wouldn't work. This woman hadn't come all this way to be turned away by a locked door. James opened it. The woman's smile widened. "James Carver, you've aged well. Teaching suits you?" "I'm sorry, do I know you?" "No, but I know you. May I come in?" There was something in her voice, not threatening exactly, but absolutely certain. A voice that expected to be obeyed. James stepped aside, and the woman entered their home, bringing with her the smell of expensive perfume and something else underneath, something earthy and dark like turned soil. Margaret came into the entryway. The woman studied her with those dark, knowing eyes. "Margaret, you've done well for yourself too. The volunteer work, the perfect family, the respectable life. Very convincing." "Who are you?" Margaret asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "My name is Adelaide Thorne. Though I suppose I could have saved us all some trouble and signed my full name on the invitation. But where's the drama in that?" She set down her bag. "The guest room is upstairs, I presume? Second door on the left? Your house hasn't changed much from the photographs." "What photographs?" James demanded. "The ones in your grandfather's study. He was quite proud of this house. Documented every room, every angle. He wanted to remember it exactly as it was." Adelaide's gaze swept over them both. "Before." The word hung in the air like smoke. "I don't know what you think you know," James started, but Adelaide held up one hand. "Please, let's not insult each other with denials. I know what happened in this house 15 years ago. I know what you did. I know what you've been hiding, and I'm here to discuss what happens next." She picked up her bag again. "But first, I'd like to freshen up from my journey. Shall we say we meet in the living room in half an hour? That should give you both time to decide how honest you want to be with me." She walked past them to the stairs, and Margaret noticed she moved with absolute familiarity, not even glancing around to orient herself. She knew where she was going. She'd known which door was the guest room without being told. She'd known James's grandfather had kept a study, had taken photographs. She knew too much. After Adelaide went upstairs, James grabbed Margaret's arm. "We need to call the police." "And tell them what? That a woman we invited into our home knows something about us? She's threatening us." "Is she?" "She hasn't actually threatened anything. She just said she wants to talk." "Margaret, this is serious. If she knows, if she really knows, then we're already finished. Calling the police won't help. It'll just speed things up." Margaret pulled away from him. "We talk to her. We find out what she wants. Maybe we can fix this." "There's no fixing this. If she knows, if she has proof, then we're dead anyway. So what difference does it make?" They stood in their entryway, the house that had been in James' family for generations, suddenly feeling like a trap, like a museum of evidence, like a crime scene they'd never properly cleaned. Upstairs, they could hear Adelaide moving around in the guest room, the creak of floorboards, the sound of a window opening. She was making herself comfortable. She was settling in. Sophie appeared at the top of the stairs. "Who's the lady?" "Just a guest, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice artificially bright. "An old family friend." "She doesn't look friendly." "What do you mean?" Sophie shrugged, suddenly looking younger than 15. "I don't know. There's something about her. Something cold." She hugged herself. "Can I sleep at Emma's tonight?" "It's a school night." "Please, Mom. I really don't want to be here." Margaret and James exchanged glances. Part of Margaret wanted to insist Sophie stay, to not let this stranger drive her daughter from her own home. But another part, the part that had been feeling dread since Tuesday morning, wanted Sophie as far away as possible from whatever was about to happen. "Call Emma's mother and make sure it's okay," James said. "I'll drive you over." Sophie disappeared into her room to pack a bag, and Margaret felt a small relief mixed with deeper fear. Whatever Adelaide wanted to discuss, at least Sophie wouldn't hear it. At least her daughter would be spared that much. 20 minutes later, James left with Sophie, and Margaret was alone in the house with Adelaide. She stood in the kitchen, hands gripping the counter, trying to steady her breathing. 15 years. 15 years of carefully constructed normalcy, of making sure nothing ever seemed out of place, of living each day as if the past had never happened. And now, this woman, this stranger, who somehow wasn't a stranger, was here to tear it all down. "You're afraid," Margaret spun around. Adelaide stood in the kitchen doorway, changed into casual clothes, but still elegant, still carrying that aura of absolute certainty. "Your daughter's lovely," Adelaide continued. "Smart, perceptive. She takes after you in that regard, though she has her father's eyes." "Don't talk about my daughter." "Why not? She's part of this family, part of this house, part of what happened here." Adelaide moved to the table and sat down without invitation. "Though I suppose she doesn't know, does she? You've kept her innocent. Understandable. What parent wants their child to know they're living in a house built on lies? What do you want?" "To talk. I said that already." "About what?" "The girl. The one who died here. The one you buried in the woods." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her legs went weak and she grabbed the back of a chair to keep from falling. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. Her name was Rachel. She was 19 years old. She came to this house on October 3rd, 2010, looking for work. Your husband's father had advertised for a live-in caregiver. He was sick, dying of cancer, needed someone to help with the daily tasks he could no longer manage. Rachel was perfect, young, strong, with nursing experience and no family to notice if she went missing for a while, or so your father-in-law thought. Margaret couldn't breathe. She heard James's car pull into the driveway, heard him come through the front door. In the living room, Margaret managed to call out, her voice strange and distant. James appeared, saw Adelaide sitting at their kitchen table, saw Margaret's face, and went pale. "What?" "I was just telling Margaret about Rachel," Adelaide said calmly. "Would you like to hear the rest, or would you prefer to tell it yourselves?" They sat. What else could they do? And once they started talking, once the seal was broken, the story poured out like water through cracked glass. James's father, Robert Carver, had been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer in early 2010. He'd been a proud man, stubborn, unwilling to go to a hospice facility, insisting on dying in his own home. James and Margaret, newly married with a baby daughter, had moved in to help care for him. But Robert was difficult, demanding, often cruel, made worse by pain and medication and the indignity of his failing body. They'd hired Rachel through an agency. She'd been young but professional, kind even when Robert was at his worst. She'd worked for them for 3 months, living in the small room off the kitchen that used to be a maid's quarters. Sophie had loved her, would cry for Rachel when her parents tried to put her to bed. Then, one October evening, everything changed. Robert had been having a particularly bad day. The pain was worse. The medications weren't working, and he'd been taking it out on everyone. Rachel had been trying to help him to the bathroom when he'd struck her, backhanded her across the face hard enough that she'd stumbled backward, hitting her head on the corner of the dresser. The sound of her skull cracking against the wood was something Margaret would never forget. Rachel had collapsed, unconscious, bleeding from a gash on her temple. They'd called 911, panicked, frantic. But Robert, even dying, even in pain, had been calculating. "If she dies," he'd said, "they'll investigate. They'll find out I hit her. They'll charge me with manslaughter or murder. I'll die in prison instead of in my own bed." "She won't die," James had said. "She's breathing. She'll wake up." But she hadn't. Her breathing had grown shallower, more labored. They'd waited 20 minutes that felt like hours, and when they finally checked her pulse again, there was nothing. Rachel was dead, and Robert had looked at them with fevered eyes and said, "We can't call anyone now. They'll never believe it was an accident. You two were here. You'll be accessories. They'll take Sophie away." "We have to tell the truth," Margaret had protested, even as fear clawed at her insides. "The truth?" Robert had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The truth is, a 19-year-old girl is dead in my bedroom because I lost my temper. The truth is you two stood there and watched her bleed out while you tried to decide what to do. The truth will destroy all of us." And somehow, though Margaret still couldn't fully explain how it had happened, how they'd been persuaded, they'd agreed. They'd help him hide it. Just until he died, Robert had promised. Then they could call the police, say they'd found Rachel's body, claim she'd been missing. By then, Robert would be gone, beyond prosecution, and they'd be innocent family members who'd been looking for their lost caregiver. They'd buried Rachel in the woods, deep in the section of forest behind their property where James had played as a child. They'd told the agency Rachel had quit suddenly, hadn't given notice. They'd cleaned the bedroom, burned the bloodstained rug, acted like nothing had happened. Robert had died 3 weeks later. And by then, too much time had passed. Calling the police would have meant explaining why they'd waited, why they'd lied, why they'd buried a body instead of reporting an accidental death. So they'd stayed silent. They'd mourned Robert publicly, sold his belongings, tried to move on. 15 years of carrying that weight, of looking over their shoulders, of waking up at 3 a.m. convinced that this would be the day someone found out. And now, someone had. When they finished talking, Adelaide sat quietly for a moment, her hands folded on the table. "Thank you for being honest. That took courage." "Are you a police officer?" Margaret asked. Though she knew that wasn't right, the police didn't send cryptic invitations. "No." "A private investigator?" "No." "Then who are you? How do you know about Rachel?" Adelaide smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I know, because Rachel was my daughter." The world tilted. Margaret heard James make a sound like he'd been punched. But she told us she didn't have family," Margaret managed. "The agency said she told you what she thought you wanted to hear." Rachel had trust issues, stemming from a difficult childhood. She'd been in foster care, had learned to be self-sufficient, to not rely on anyone. She told employers she had no family because she thought it made her seem more dedicated, more available. But she had me. She called me every Sunday, and when she stopped calling, when I couldn't reach her, when the agency told me she'd quit without notice, Adelaide's voice remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes. I knew something was wrong. Rachel wouldn't just disappear. She wouldn't leave without telling me. "Why didn't you go to the police?" James asked. "I did. They looked into it, but they couldn't find anything suspicious. As far as anyone could tell, Rachel had decided to leave, maybe move to another city, start fresh somewhere. It happens with young people. The police weren't going to waste resources looking for an adult who'd left of her own accord." Adelaide's fingers tightened slightly, but I didn't believe it, so I looked myself. I spent years looking, following leads, talking to people, piecing together her last days, and eventually I found the truth. "How?" Margaret whispered. "Your father-in-law kept a journal. Did you know that? Toward the end, when the pain was bad and he couldn't sleep, he'd write about his life, his regrets, his sins. He wrote about Rachel, about hitting her, about convincing you to hide what happened, about dying with that secret eating at him." Adelaide pulled a small notebook from her pocket and set it on the table. He gave it to his lawyer with instructions to store it in a safety deposit box for 20 years after his death. I don't know why. Maybe he thought enough time would pass that it wouldn't matter. Maybe he wanted someone to know eventually. Maybe it was his version of confession. But the lawyer recently retired and was going through old files. He found the journal, read it, felt obligated to do something. He contacted me through the agency that had placed Rachel with your family. James reached for the journal, but Adelaide pulled it back. "Not yet. First, we talk about what happens next." "You're going to the police," Margaret said, dully. "You're going to show them the journal, tell them where to dig, and we're going to prison." "That's one option. What's the other option?" Adelaide was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. "The other option is that you give me what I came here for." "Which is?" "My daughter. I want to bring Rachel home. I want to bury her properly, with a headstone and prayers and all the dignity she deserved 15 years ago. And I want you to confess, not to the police, not publicly, but to me. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me you're sorry for what happened, for the choice you made, for leaving my daughter in the ground like garbage. And then I decide whether that's enough, whether your remorse is genuine, whether you deserve the chance to keep your life, your family, your carefully constructed normalcy." Adelaide leaned forward. "Or whether justice requires something more." They sat in silence, the kitchen clock ticking away, seconds that felt like heartbeats. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking. Normal sounds, the sounds of a normal evening in a normal house. Except nothing was normal anymore. Maybe it never had been. "Where is she?" Adelaide asked quietly. "Where did you bury my daughter?" James's voice was hoarse. "In the woods, about half a mile back, near an old stone wall." "Show me." They walked through the darkness, James leading with a flashlight, Adelaide behind him, Margaret bringing up the rear. The woods felt different at night, older, more primal, the trees pressing close and the shadows moving with purpose. Margaret had avoided this part of their property for 15 years, couldn't bear to walk where Rachel lay. But now she had no choice. The stone wall loomed out of the darkness, ancient and crumbling, a remnant of when this land had been farmland generations ago. James stopped about 20 feet from it, the flashlight beam wavering. "Here," he said. "We buried her here." Adelaide stood looking at the spot. Even in the darkness, Margaret could see tears on her cheeks. "Did you mark it? Did you leave anything?" "No, we couldn't. If someone found a marker, so for 15 years, my daughter has been here alone, in the dark, unmarked, forgotten." "We didn't forget," Margaret said, and her own tears were falling now. "We've thought about her every day. We've carried this." "Don't." Adelaide's voice was sharp. "Don't tell me about your burden. You chose this. You chose to protect yourselves instead of honoring Rachel's life, her death, her memory. You chose convenience over conscience. So don't stand here and tell me how hard it's been for you." They stood in the woods, three people bound together by tragedy and guilt and a secret that had taken 15 years to come to light. Above them, clouds scudded across the moon, and the wind carried the smell of coming rain. "I'll arrange for someone to come," Adelaide said finally, quietly. "People who can exhume her remains without involving the authorities. It will cost you, not just money, though there will be that, but you'll also have to live knowing that I could still destroy you anytime I choose, that I hold your future in my hands, that you'll never be free of this. Not really." "We'll do whatever you want," James said. "Will you? Would you confess publicly if I asked? Would you go to prison if that's what I demanded?" He hesitated, and Adelaide saw it. She nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. Your remorse has limits. Your conscience only extends as far as your comfort allows." "That's not fair," Margaret protested. "We have a daughter. Sophie is innocent in all this. If we go to prison, her life is ruined. And what about Rachel's life? What about the future she should have had? She wanted to be a doctor. Did you know that? She was saving money for medical school. She had dreams, plans, people she would have helped. But she died before any of that could happen. And you took away even her right to a proper burial." There was no answer to that, no defense. They stood in the darkness with their guilt laid bare, and for the first time in 15 years, Margaret felt something like relief. The secret was out. The weight was shared. However this ended, at least they didn't have to carry it alone anymore. Adelaide turned to leave. "I'll be staying for a few more days while I make the arrangements. I suggest you keep your daughter away. And don't think about running. I have copies of the journal in multiple locations. If anything happens to me, they'll be sent to the police immediately." She walked back toward the house, leaving James and Margaret standing in the woods where Rachel lay. After a moment, Margaret whispered, "We should say something. Some kind of, I don't know, prayer? Apology?" James shook his head. "It's too late for that. It's never too late. It is when you're only sorry because you got caught." They went back to the house in silence. Adelaide had already retired to the guest room, the door closed, a line of light visible underneath. Margaret and James sat in their living room, not speaking, not touching, each alone with their thoughts. Around midnight, Margaret heard it. Footsteps upstairs, moving through the hallway, down the stairs. But when she looked, no one was there. The guest room door remained closed, the light still on. Yet the footsteps continued, pacing back and forth, the sound of someone restless, unable to sleep. She told herself it was the house settling. Old houses made noise, but deep down she knew better. Some part of Rachel had come home with Adelaide, drawn by the promise of finally being found, finally being acknowledged. Some part of her was walking through the house where she died, remembering. The footsteps continued every night Adelaide stayed. Margaret would hear them after midnight, soft and deliberate, moving through rooms on the second floor, pausing at doorways, ascending to the attic, descending to the basement. Sometimes they'd stop outside Sophie's empty room, and Margaret would hear something like crying, though it might have been the wind. James pretended not to hear anything, but Margaret caught him watching the stairs with wide eyes, flinching at sounds that weren't there, or sounds that were there but shouldn't have been. On the third night, Margaret woke at 2 a.m. to find Adelaide standing in her bedroom doorway. Just standing there, a silhouette against the hall light, perfectly still. "Adelaide?" Margaret whispered. No response. The figure stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, then turned and walked away. Margaret heard footsteps going downstairs, heard the back door open, heard someone walk out into the yard. She got up and went to the window. In the moonlight, she could see a figure walking towards the woods. But it wasn't Adelaide's purposeful stride. It was the uncertain walk of someone much younger, someone who'd been hurt and didn't quite remember how to move properly. Margaret stood at the window until the figure disappeared into the trees, then got back into bed beside her sleeping husband and stared at the ceiling until dawn. The excavation happened on the 5th day. Adelaide had arranged for a small crew, discreet professionals who asked no questions and worked quickly. James and Margaret were not allowed to be present. They stayed in the house, listening to the sounds of digging, of careful searching, of something being found. Around noon, Adelaide came to the back door. She was covered in dirt, her face streaked with tears and something like triumph. "We found her," she said, simply. "What's left of her. It's enough. It's enough to bring her home." They stood looking at each other, and Margaret wanted to say something, to offer condolences or apologies, or some combination of both. But before she could speak, Adelaide continued. "She was wearing a necklace, a small silver locket. Did you notice it when she was alive?" Margaret nodded slowly. "She wore it every day, said it was from her mother." "It was. I gave it to her on her 18th birthday. My grandmother's locket, passed down through generations. I'd hoped she'd pass it to her own daughter someday." Adelaide pulled the locket from her pocket, now tarnished and dirt-caked. "This is all I have left of her. This and bones and the memory of who she could have been." "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered. "I'm so sorry." "I know. But sorry doesn't change anything, does it? Sorry doesn't bring her back. Sorry doesn't undo 15 years of her body being forgotten in the woods. Sorry is just a word people say when they don't know what else to do." Adelaide left that evening. She packed her bag, cleaned the guest room as if she'd never been there, and stood on the porch saying goodbye, as if this had been a pleasant social visit. "I won't call the police," she said. "Not because you deserve mercy, but because Rachel deserves peace. Dragging this through a trial, through media coverage, through years of appeals, would only defile her memory further. So I'm letting you keep your life, your family, your house. But know this, you'll never truly be free of this. You'll always wonder if today is the day I change my mind. You'll always look over your shoulder. You'll always carry the knowledge of what you did and what it cost. Will you at least tell us where you bury her?" Margaret asked. "So we can, I don't know, visit? Pay our respects?" Adelaide's smile was cold. "No, you don't get that. You don't get closure or absolution or the comfort of ritual. You get to wonder always where she is. Just like I wondered for 15 years. She got in her car and drove away, and they never saw her again. But the house changed after Adelaide left. The footsteps continued, no longer just after midnight, but at all hours. Margaret would hear them upstairs when she was cooking dinner, would hear them in the basement when she was doing laundry, would hear them right behind her. Sometimes, though, when she turned, there was nothing there. Sophie noticed too when she came back home. "There's someone in my room at night," she said one morning at breakfast. "I hear them breathing. Sometimes I feel them sit on the edge of my bed. It's just the house settling, James said automatically. Houses don't breathe, Dad. They called in contractors to check for drafts, for mice, for any rational explanation for the sounds. The contractors found nothing wrong. The house was solid, empty of pests, exactly as it should be, except it wasn't empty. Not anymore. Margaret started seeing her. Just glimpses at first. A young woman in the corner of her vision, wearing outdated clothes, her face turned away. Margaret would spin around and see nothing, but the presence would remain, heavy and watchful. Over time, the glimpses became clearer, lasted longer. The woman looked like Rachel, or what Rachel might have looked like if she'd aged 15 years beyond 19, if death had been allowed to transform her into something else. Sometimes Margaret would find things moved. A book she'd left on the table, now on the mantel. A photograph turned face down, her car keys in the freezer. Small disturbances, barely noticeable individually, but accumulating into a pattern of deliberate disruption. James handled it by refusing to acknowledge anything was happening. He went to work, came home, ate dinner, watched TV, went to bed. He didn't talk about the sounds or the presences or the way Sophie had started sleeping with her light on. He just lived as if everything was normal, as if, by pretending hard enough, he could make it true. But Margaret couldn't pretend. She'd never been good at it, even before Rachel, even before that October evening that had changed everything. And now, with Rachel's presence filling the house like smoke, there was no room left for denial. One night, unable to sleep, Margaret went downstairs to make tea. Rachel was sitting at the kitchen table. Not a glimpse, not a shadow. Fully present, solid seeming, wearing the same clothes she died in with dirt still clinging to her hair. She looked up as Margaret entered, and her eyes were dark and knowing and infinitely sad. "Hello," Rachel said. Her voice was exactly as Margaret remembered, young, slightly uncertain, kind despite everything. Margaret's hands were shaking. "You're not real." "Aren't I? You buried me. You helped hide what happened. You're the reason I spent 15 years in the ground. I feel pretty real to me. What do you want?" "Want?" Rachel tilted her head. "I want to have lived. I want to have finished nursing school. I want to have helped people, fallen in love, maybe had children. I want all the years that were taken from me. But since I can't have those, I'll settle for haunting the people who stole them. We didn't mean for you to die. It was an accident. Accidents are what happen in the moment. Choices are what happen after. You chose to hide me. You chose to lie. You chose your comfort over my dignity. Those weren't accidents, Margaret. Those were decisions." Margaret sank into a chair. "So what now? You haunt us forever? We never have peace? Did you give me peace? Did you let me rest?" Rachel leaned forward. "You want to know the worst part? It's not being dead. It's being forgotten, being erased. Adelaide looked for me, but the rest of the world just moved on. My apartment was rented to someone else. My things were donated. My nursing program slot was filled. It was like I'd never existed. And you two just went on with your lives, had your family dinners, celebrated holidays, tucked your daughter into bed every night, while I rotted in the woods. I'm sorry?" "Sorry," Rachel laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. Adelaide was right. Sorry doesn't change anything. She stood, and as she moved toward the door, she started to fade, becoming translucent, then transparent, then just a shimmer in the air. But her voice remained, echoing through the kitchen even after she disappeared. "This house remembers, Margaret, and it won't let you forget." After that night, the hauntings intensified. Objects flew from shelves. Water ran from faucets that no one had turned on. The temperature would drop so suddenly they could see their breath. Sophie started having nightmares, waking up screaming about a woman with dirt in her hair who stood by her bed asking why Sophie got to grow up when she didn't. James finally broke. "We have to leave. Sell the house. Move somewhere else. And you think she won't follow? Margaret asked. You think we can outrun guilt? We have to try. For Sophie's sake, she doesn't deserve this. Rachel didn't deserve what happened to her, but here we are. They put the house on the market. It sat for months without any offers. People would come for showings, take one step inside, and immediately find reasons to leave. Too old, they'd say. Needs too much work. Bad energy. Something's off. The real estate agent started asking questions about the property's history, whether anything traumatic had happened there. Nothing, James lied. Just a normal family home. But the house knew better, and so did Rachel. One morning, Margaret came downstairs to find writing on the living room wall, scratched into the paint. She knows. And underneath, in smaller letters, she'll always know. Sophie saw it before they could clean it off. Who's she? What does it mean? Margaret couldn't answer. How do you explain to your daughter that their home is haunted by a woman her parents helped bury? How do you teach a child that sometimes good people make terrible choices, and those choices have consequences that last forever? They brought in a priest. He came, performed a blessing, sprinkled holy water in every room. For 3 days, the house was quiet. Then the activity started again, worse than before, as if Rachel was angry at the attempt to push her out. They tried a medium. She walked through the front door, immediately turned pale, and refused to go further. There's someone here, she said. Someone young, someone angry. And she's bound to this place by more than death. She's bound by injustice. Can you help her move on? Margaret begged. Only if she wants to. But from what I'm sensing, she's not ready to go. She has unfinished business. She wants something from you. What? What does she want? The medium shook her head. Only she can tell you that. And you need to be willing to listen. That night, Margaret sat alone in the living room, all the lights off, and spoke to the darkness. Rachel, are you here? The temperature dropped. Margaret's breath misted. I'm listening now. Tell me what you want. Tell me how to make this right. For a long moment, nothing. Then Rachel materialized in front of her, more solid than she'd ever appeared before, and sat down on the couch. I want you to tell the truth, Rachel said. Not just to me, not just to Adelaide, to everyone. I want my story known. I want people to know what happened to me, how I died, where I was buried. I want my life to have mattered enough that someone cared when it ended. If we do that, we'll go to prison. Sophie will be alone. And that's my problem, Hal. You made choices that protected you. Now I'm making a choice that protects my memory. Fair is fair. Please, Margaret whispered. There has to be another way. Some compromise. There is no compromise with truth, Margaret. It either is or it isn't. You either tell what happened or you don't. And if you don't, I'll spend the rest of your lives making sure you never forget me. I'll be in every shadow, every sound, every moment of peace you try to steal. I'll be the thing Sophie sees when she closes her eyes. I'll be the reason James can't sleep. I'll be your constant companion, your eternal punishment, your haunting. She stood, began to fade again. You have 1 week to decide. Tell the truth or live with me forever. Your choice. Margaret told James everything the next morning. He listened with his head in his hands, looking older than she'd ever seen him. We can't confess, he said finally. We have Sophie to think about. Her future, her stability, her mental health. She's already being affected by all this. What would it do to her to know her parents are murderers? We're not murderers. It was an accident. We're accessories after the fact. We helped hide a body. We lied to investigators. We've been covering up a crime for 15 years. That's multiple felonies, Margaret. We'd both go to prison for years. And what's the alternative? Live like this? Have our daughter grow up in a haunted house, tormented by a ghost we created through our own cowardice? We'll figure something out. There has to be a way to make this stop without destroying our lives. But there wasn't. They both knew it. The only way forward was truth. And truth meant consequences they weren't ready to face. The week passed. They did nothing. They said nothing. They just lived in their haunted house with their frightened daughter and their terrible secret, hoping somehow that time would solve what conscience couldn't. On the 8th day, Sophie disappeared. She went to school in the morning and never came home. They got the call at 4 p.m. Sophie hadn't been in any of her afternoon classes. No one had seen her since lunch. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her friends didn't know where she was. The police came. They searched. They put out an alert. They questioned everyone. And James and Margaret sat in their living room, drowning in fear and guilt because they knew. They knew where Sophie had gone, even if they couldn't prove it, couldn't explain it, couldn't tell the investigators that their daughter had been taken by a ghost. At midnight, Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "She's with me, in the woods, where I waited for 15 years. Come alone if you want her back." Margaret showed James. "I'm going." "Not alone." Rachel said, "I don't care what she said. I'm not letting you walk into the woods at night to meet a ghost." They went together, flashlights cutting through the darkness, retracing the path they'd walked with Adelaide. The stone wall emerged from the shadows, and there, sitting with her back against it, was Sophie. And sitting beside her, barely visible in the flashlight beam, was Rachel. "Sophie!" Margaret rushed forward, but Rachel held up one hand. "She's fine, just sleeping." I wanted her to understand what it feels like. To be taken. To be somewhere she doesn't want to be, wondering if anyone's looking for her, wondering if she'll ever go home. "Please," James said, "let her go. Punish us if you want. But leave our daughter alone." "Why? You involved her the moment you chose to hide what happened. Every day you kept that secret, you bound her more tightly to your crime. She lives in a house built on lies. She's been shaped by guilt you refuse to acknowledge. She's already part of this story. I'm just making that explicit. What do you want from us?" Margaret was crying now, openly, desperately. "Tell us, and we'll do it. Anything. Just give us back our daughter." Rachel studied them both for a long moment. "Tell the truth. All of it. To the police, to the newspapers, to everyone. Let people know what happened to me. Let my death mean something. Give me back the dignity of being remembered. We'll go to prison. Yes, you will. But Sophie will be free. She'll be free of this house, free of your guilt, free of me. She'll grow up knowing her parents made a terrible mistake, but eventually found the courage to make it right. Isn't that better than growing up with ghosts?" James and Margaret looked at each other. 15 years of marriage, of partnership, of shared burden. They'd made this mess together. Now they had to face it together. "Okay," James said quietly. "We'll tell." Rachel smiled, and for the first time there was warmth in it. "Thank you." She touched Sophie's shoulder gently, and the girl stirred, waking slowly like someone emerging from a deep sleep. "Mom? Dad?" Sophie looked around, confused. "What am I doing out here?" "It's okay, sweetheart," Margaret said, helping her up. "Everything's going to be okay." They walked back to the house together, and for the first time in 15 years, the woods felt peaceful. Behind them, barely visible in the darkness, Rachel stood watching them go. But she didn't follow. She stayed by the stone wall, where she'd waited so long, finally at peace with what was to come. They called the police at dawn. They confessed everything. The accident, the cover-up, the burial, the years of silence. They showed them the woods, the spot where Rachel had lain, now empty but marked by disturbed earth. They gave statements, were arrested, were charged. The trial was brief. They both pleaded guilty. The judge, taking into account the circumstances and their eventual honesty, sentenced them to 5 years each. Sophie went to live with Margaret's sister in Vermont. She visited them in prison every month, and they told her everything. About Rachel, about their mistakes, about how guilt can poison a life more surely than any toxin. She was angry, hurt, confused, but she was also free of the hauntings, free of the presence that had tormented their home. The house on Birch Street sat empty for 2 years before finally selling to a young couple who knew nothing of its history. They reported no strange occurrences, no unexplained sounds, no presences in the night. Rachel had moved on, satisfied with the justice she'd demanded. Margaret and James served their sentences, were released on parole, started again with nothing but their marriage and their daughter, and the knowledge that some debts must eventually be paid, no matter how long you try to hide from them. They never moved back to Holloway. They couldn't bear to. But sometimes, on autumn evenings, when the light fails and the shadows grow long, they think about Rachel, about the girl they failed, about the ghost who wouldn't let them forget. And they wonder if forgiveness is something you can earn, or if some sins simply have to be carried forever, like stones in your pockets, pulling you down no matter how hard you try to swim. In the woods behind the old house on Birch Street, where the stone wall crumbles into earth and time itself seems to pause between heartbeats, there's a place where nothing grows anymore, where the ground remembers what it once held, and on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind carries voices from the past, people say they can hear singing, young and sweet and impossibly sad, the sound of someone who waited 15 years to be found and finally let her story be told.